again, I'm Teresa. This is Lost My Thread. Today I'm going to be sharing with you another one of my favorite sewing tools, my bias binding maker set. Lots of sewing projects call for bias binding, and you can always just buy it from a fabric shop or from a small independent seller, but you can also make your own, which is what I will usually prefer to do. The nice thing about making your own bias binding is that it uses up some odds and ends and scraps of the fabric that you're not able to use up in other ways, but also it means that you can make your garments just that little bit more unique. Sometimes I will make a decision to have matching bias binding to make sure that it's going to look very neat on the inside and the outside, that it's all going to match really nicely, or I might choose to use a contrasting bias binding so there's a little bit of a pop of color or a pop of a pattern on the inside of my garment that obviously I'm the only one who's going to see, but I do appreciate when I put that garment on or see it hanging on the hanger. If you did want to make your own bias binding, you can make it without this tool, but I think it's a whole lot easier with the tool. I recently made the Barden dress by LB Textiles, which was one of the free patterns from Peppermint magazine. When I made this dress, I used this tool a lot. So I used it not only for the classic neck binding and the classic sleeve binding, I also chose to use it at the hem of this dress as well, so that way it could all tie together really nice and cohesively as a garment. The bias tape making sets are all going to be pretty similar. I got mine from Amazon. It's not like a name brand or anything like that. It calls itself CY-BTM-S2, but I think the principles are the same regardless of what brand you're going to get. It does tell you inside here what size tool to use depending on how wide the fabric is, whether it's a thicker fabric or a thinner fabric as well. But I can show you here what you get inside. So the key things to point out is we have 4 different sizes of tools that you're going to use to make the bias tape. You also, in this case, get an awl, and this is a really great bonus, I will say. I love using this awl for all kinds of things. I use it for poking holes for making like jeans rivets and jeans buttons. I've used it for installing snaps. Basically anywhere you want to poke a hole through your fabric, this is going to be a really nice, neat way to do that. And because it gets bigger as it gets sort of wider as you go further into it, you can make that hole a little bit bigger if it's not quite big enough, a little bit bigger if it's not quite big enough, to make sure you get the exact size right hole. So super handy little bonus there. Now, before I get into all the details about how to make bias binding, I thought it would make sense to tell you what bias binding is and what its function is. So if you imagine that this is a piece of fabric, we've got our 2 salvage edges going along the long end, and these are the pre-cut edges that you had cut at the fabric shop. What you're wanting to do is cut the fabric at a 45-degree angle to this salvage edge. And to do that easily, there's a couple of ways you can do it. I have got a quilting ruler, and as you can see there are different angled measurements on this ruler. So if I want to cut at a 45-degree angle, I just put the edge of that 45-degree line along the edge of the paper, and that is going to be then a 45-degree angle from this edge. So if I was, say, cutting out some fabric, I might put this down and then use a rotary cutter to cut along this line. Or you could just use a ruler if you wanted to do that and trace the line out and then cut it later. And then I have my one single line that is 45 degrees from the salvage edge. If I was going to be doing, say, 1-inch strips, which is what I'm doing in the particular project that I'm working on now, I would then work along with my quilting ruler. This is the 1-inch mark. I would make sure that that was lined up with my previous mark, or at the edge if I've cut that with a rotary cutter, and then I would make my next cut, or again my next line, and that is then my 1-inch strip of bias tape. So that is one way you can do it if you happen to have a quilting ruler on hand. If you do not have a quilting ruler, you can still do this just by folding the fabric over. So if you have one of your pre-cut edges and the salvage edge along here, you just want to line the 2 up with each other. Obviously you want to make sure that's a nice straight line. If you match those up really neatly, you can then, with a pair of scissors, just cut along that line, and that way you then will have a strip or a sort of a line cut exactly at 45-degree angles from the edge. So we are exactly the same angle you can see there. So that's 2 ways that you can make it. The purpose of bias tape and the reason why you might want to cut your fabric in this way is because bias tape itself has a bit of stretch to it because it's cut on the opposite direction to the selvage edge. You can actually pull and stretch this fabric a bit, as you can see. So if you're going to be, say, trying to put this around maybe a neckline edge, let's imagine this is our kind of neckline edge, what you can do is you can place one point onto the edge of the fabric and you can stretch the bias tape so that it is able to pull around there, but you can still then fold this underneathly against your fabric. So that's just a very rudimentary way of explaining how to do it, and now I'm going to show you how I make my bias binding. If you wanted to make bias binding and you didn't have a set like this, you can absolutely make bias binding with no real tools at all. All you would do is take your bias strips, fold them in half, and then press along that folded edge. You would then open that out and then press the edges into that little crease in the middle. As you can probably see, it gets a little bit treacherous, trying to avoid the steam. And that is your single fold bias tape. You can then fold that in half again and press if you want double fold bias tape. So I have now pressed this flat or relatively flat compared to where it was before. I'm going to take my tools here. As far as picking the size of which of these you want to use, I find that it works pretty well if you just look to see what's about half the size of the binding strip that you're making. If you do get it wrong, it's not the end of the world. You can always take it off and just do it with a different size, but that's usually pretty accurate, or you can use the guide that's inside the instructions. And what you're going to do is you're going to insert the tip of your fabric into here, just gradually working that in there. If it's not coming through easily, you can just use your awl. That's where that awl comes in handy, where you can pull it through or even push from this top end. What you want to try and make sure happens is you maintain sort of this nice and straight line. Sometimes it can get a bit bunched to one side or the other and it's not going to go through as smoothly. Once you've got that tip coming through, you're just going to take your hot iron, press, pull this back a little bit, press, pull it back a little bit, and press. As you can see, it's making these folds that I was doing with my hands, but without me having to do the work or burn my fingers. So it's folding those edges into the middle. I also used the same tool to make some waist ties for the Barden dress because I felt like it was a little bit looser and more oversized than I wanted for my silhouette. So I added some little waist ties into the side seam. Now here I have got a strip of fabric that is cut on the grain line, so it's not cut on the bias, so it's not going to have any extra real stretch to it, which is what I want. I want it to be relatively stable. And I have just cut some strips out that are 3.5 centimeters wide, so about 1 3/8 of an inch wide, and I've cut them the length that I think I want them to be. I can't remember what that was, and I'll pop it up here so I can tell you exactly the length that I've gone for. And I'm going to use my bias binding tool in very much the same way, but obviously I'm not doing it with bias strips, and I'm just going to turn that over as I did before, try and feed this through. This one does not poke through quite as easily, probably because there's just a little bit more texture to this fabric. So I'm going to go ahead and use my awl tool to bring it through, slowly, slowly, till it's just coming out on the end here, as you can see. And then I want to make sure that that's all lying nice and flat, and then go ahead and start pressing. Pull this back a little more and press. Pull this back a little more and press. And just like before, I'm going to continue until I've done the whole length of this strip. Now this is one that I have already completed, so we can set this over here. I have made the whole strip and I have worked along the whole length of it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to fold the middle sections over, press that in place, and then I'm going to stitch along both edges of here, and that is going to be the tie that I'm going to use for the waist tie. Now I wasn't so fussed about what happened right at the end here, because I do want to make sure that this raw edge gets enclosed anyway. So I'm going to fold this up once and twice, about 1/4 inch each side, fold these into the middle, fold it over itself again, and that is going to give me a neat little end that I can go around the edge of to avoid having any raw edges there. So this one really is one of my favorite sewing tools. I use it really quite a lot, but it's also just really fun and satisfying to use when you're just moving the tool and it's gliding right through as you're ironing it. It's so satisfying. It really is a big time saver for me as well. I think if you are someone who makes a lot of bias tape, I think this really would be a good investment. It was not a very expensive one, another one of my pretty inexpensive sewing tools, but I feel like it is really valuable for me. Even just the awl alone, I use so much in my other sewing, so I feel like that for me was a good investment. If you've used one of these and you've had success or failure with it, let me know. I want to hear all about it. And if you have got any sewing tools that you really like that are a lot of fun to use, I want to hear about those too. So let me know down below in the comments. If you liked my video, I do always appreciate those likes. It really helps other people to find my channel, and consider subscribing if you want to see more. I'll see you soon. Bye.